And we're recording. Here we go. You shouldn't have any problems knowing where we are. We haven't been moving real fast, but we are actually getting toward the end of this. Today we're going to look at verses 35 to 49, and I want to put you in a right place to understand this. At least I hope I will. We come to chapter 15, and quite frankly, when you've been studying in 1 Corinthians as we have, it almost seems incongruous. It seems like it's an odd chapter that Paul throws in here. You go that Paul has been just rapid firing after one problem after another. He's addressing issue after issue in this church. And then all of a sudden, for 58 verses, he goes after a doctrinal thing. And he goes after a doctrinal issue where, frankly, the Corinthians have about 90% of it right. Now, this has to be their best percentage ever in any of the issues we've dealt with in this book. They've got it 90% right. They believe that Christ came in human flesh, God in human flesh. They believe that he was crucified, died as a man on a cross, was placed in a grave, and rose again bodily. And that sounds really good, doesn't it? 90% right. But they can't quite grasp this idea that that resurrection is guaranteeing their resurrection. And this is where the problem lies. You kind of think, well, so what? They've got the basic. I've actually had Christians tell me this, what's the big deal? How this is going to work? What if it's going to be a spiritual resurrection or a bodily resurrection? At least they got the gospel right. How is this a problem? Well, I'm going to show you some of that today, but part of the problem is God's truth doesn't allow you to pick and choose which parts of it you want to believe. Also understand this, that redemption is meant to be complete, both body and spirit. As God created man, so he's going to redeem man. These are the realities. But here's why this chapter matters. Because this chapter is not an oddball stuck at the end of this book. It really encapsulates the entirety of the problem of why the Corinthians can't get anything right. What is going on here is an issue of culture. And I want you to understand that. The church in Corinth is placed in a culture, a pagan culture, that has completely different values and completely different understandings and a completely different view of the divine. Here's what I want you to see. Gods were very different than God. If you look at all of the other religions of the earth, they are based in myth and legend and ridiculous stories. I mean, who has read Ulysses, right? Goes on an island, meets a cyclops. The whole thing of hanging under the sheep and all the weird stuff that went on. All these bizarre things, the Song of the Sirens. It's all based on myth and legend. It is all bizarre stories of gods who are capricious and, quite frankly, have no moral compass whatsoever, who play games with men. There are all of these bizarre things, and if you've read through the Hindu faith or the other faith, there's these strange stories that come up. Paganism has no sense of focus or values, and here's what I want you to see. These people had become Christians in Corinth, but they had not stepped completely away from the worldview that they were supposed to leave behind. They were still enmeshed in this old thing, and understand what a difference that is and why this is a problem. This is what Paul is focusing on here. It's a problem. Your worldview matters. Do you understand what the big difference it is for us as Christians between us and the world right now? How we think, what issues differentiate us, and how we approach things, how we look at life in general. Anybody to give a shot? What's different?
We have absolutes.
We have absolutes. There is objective truth. Do you understand how foundational that idea is in changing life? Objective truth. There is a reality that does not change based on your opinion. That is huge. Do you understand? Western culture leapfrogged ahead of the rest of the world. And quite frankly, history says they shouldn't have. The fall of the Roman Empire, they delved into the Dark Ages. City-states, there was a conglomeration of all these mixtures of people bickering, battling all the time. Why did this Western culture suddenly leapfrog ahead of the rest of the world? And I mean, it was not a small change. It wasn't because the Europeans were just better people than anybody else. Have you looked at them? They weren't smarter, they weren't more capable. What changed? in the Western world.
They have absolutes with God, they have one God.
Christianity. Here's what changed. Two critical things that made Western culture change and move ahead, and why it is dying today. One was this: we have a creator God, an absolute God, who created things and put them in focus with laws that govern what happens. You know what the basis of science is? Order. That God created things that work a certain way, and if I look at them and observe it and test, I can figure out how it works. Because God doesn't work one way today and another way tomorrow. Have you noticed how the Greek gods acted? You had no idea what was going to happen tomorrow based on what happened yesterday. Things could go anywhere with them. They were playing games. And here's the other one: objective truth. There is a moral truth in the world that does not care about your opinion. Have you looked at our culture? What is now governing our culture? Very much. All truth is based on what now? How I feel.
Whatever they think.
Objective truth does not govern. I know they want to pretend that we become so sophisticated. We're in the information age. I find it amazing we're in the information age where more truth is available to us than any other time in history, and we do not understand the concept of truth anymore.
We're the most stupid.
We are the dumbest generation ever in terms of understanding that. Objective truth, that something holds fast, that something is unchangeable, is gone in our culture. Science does not govern. You look at this whole thing of transgenderism. It is how you feel that determines things. Right now, I don't know if you know a man named Jordan Peterson. He's a Canadian psychologist. Jordan Peterson has been fined in order to retraining classes in Canada. You know why he's been sent there? He committed the ultimate sin in Canada. He made this comment: there are only men and women. And he's got I believe a $40,000 fine, if I'm not mistaken, and he has to go in for training classes so that he can get away from this ridiculous, basic biological fact. This is what I want you to see in here. That's not new. Understand this: the culture around us has not become so scientifically adept it no longer needs faith. It has become so pagan it doesn't understand facts. That's the reality of our culture today. It cannot understand basic facts. And this is what Paul has been going after here. And one of the first things he wanted them to understand is it matters that you leave off and say, well, I believe Jesus Christ came in human flesh, that he died, was crucified and died, was placed in a grave and rose bodily, but not me. Because as we said, if one person is given the right to rewrite truth, if you can say, you know, that doctrine is gone, and you are now the arbiter of that, you have decided that, and we go, well, that's just a small change. But the problem is, once we've established your right to change it, what does that tell us? Anyone can. Brian can go along, well, I happen to not like the first thing. I'll take that one out. Jesus didn't come in human flesh. It was a spiritual reality. So there's no resurrection. And you can then strip everything back. Once you do not have objective truth that doesn't depend on your opinion, everything is up for grabs. So the first thing you wanted to understand was that there is truth in here. You can't play games with that. Now here in our new section, I want you to look at this. Paul is going to go after the core of the problem. Verse 35, just see this. But someone will ask. I want you to stop right there. And I want you to understand the setting. Let me ask you this. Have you ever had a situation where someone asked you a question and you could tell immediately it had nothing to do with wanting an answer? You ever had someone ask a question because they know the question is designed to expose a flaw in your thinking, and what they're really saying is, isn't it true you're an idiot?
When'd you stop?
And I was going to say I'm married, of course.
Okay. You look at these, and that's basically what we have here is a question that is not a question, it's a comment. The world is looking at Christianity, and they're so smart. This Greco-Roman world, we're basically in a Greek culture here in Corinth. This Greek culture is so smart that they look at the doctrine of the resurrection and say, isn't it true that you can't explain how this works at all? Isn't this the dumbest, when you're honest, isn't this really the dumbest thing you've ever tried to sell me? That's the question here. Now, Paul is going to answer the question. Actually, there's two parts to it. The two parts come down to this. How is the resurrection possible, and in what kind of body are we resurrected? Now, do you think Christians kind of want to know answers to this? Yeah, I think so. So it's useful to us, but understand it's not coming from that. It's coming from a culture that says, obviously, you don't have enough brains to understand why this is a dumb idea. This is the culture that has cowed the Corinthian church. They are so concerned with how people view them that they are willing to compromise their faith. Does that sound familiar? Nothing new under the sun, is there? What he's addressing here is that core problem. Why can't you get this right? I dealt with that for 45 years of working at Cal State University, Northridge. The professors who used to love to look for something, this was the thing that I thought was funny. They opened their Bibles probably for the first time in their lives. Some of them probably had to get a Bible, but they weren't looking to find truth. They were looking to find something they could ask a question to make me look like an idiot. You betcha. I got to find something in here that sounds so silly when I ask you, isn't that obviously silly? Yes.
Somebody at CSUN, the professor asked me, how old is the earth? And they were asking that just to point out. He went on a lecture on how old the earth he thinks is, like billions of years.
Oh, yeah.
He's only asking, like you said, to really talk about something.
It had nothing to do with getting any information or having a discussion. He wasn't even willing to sit down and talk to you and say, well, let's just compare ideas and see. No, the question was to set up an opportunity to say, look how smart I am and how dumb you are.
Yeah. Yeah,
And
it's
that
really-
was the goal.
It's really, let me see how stupid you are.
Exactly. And that's what we're dealing with in this section. It opens with that whole thing. Someone will ask. Someone always has to ask. It's always the smart aleck that wants to embarrass someone else. It's meant to be intimidating, and it's condescending in every way in its view of Christianity, and it is not new. And it comes from a Greek culture, and understand this, arrogance is always at the core of this. If you haven't looked at human history, arrogance drives human history. Alexander the Great traveled around with an historian because he wanted to make sure that everybody knew Alexander the Great was great. Arrogance drives this. And here's the thing, the Greek culture considered itself the most philosophically insightful, the most morally upright, the most careful. They were the greatest thinkers the world had ever produced. The Romans hated the Greeks. They hated the Greeks. There was no saying, and please don't be offended by this, there was no saying among the Romans, the Greeks think they invented everything from religion to sex. That's how they saw it. Those Greeks think they invented everything. You know why the Romans hated the Greeks for doing that? Because the Romans obviously invented everything. It's our job to be arrogant. Don't get in my turf. That was the problem. How dare you be doing? That's my job. And the Romans hated them for that. And Paul is dealing in this world. And that's why this chapter comes up. What Paul wants to do here is take us back to something and get us to understand our faith. I've told you this repeatedly, and I hope it's starting to sink in. The biggest distinction between our God and their God is our God acts in history and invites man to look. Their gods always have stories that no one can verify, no one can see. Our God has his prophets write about history, he delivers in history, and then he goes, did you see what I did? He invites man to look. He's a God of history. He acts in real places with real people in real time, and it's recorded as historical fact. That's been Paul's opening. The first 11 verses talked about that. How do we know there was a resurrection? There are witnesses. People saw it. And do you think people might have noticed that was a unique event in history? When hundreds of people are going, that's different, you might want to take note of that. People saw it. People wrote it down. How is history recorded? People see it and write it down. How much more can we trust history? By the number of reliable witnesses who have nothing to gain, who report the same thing. No event in history has had more reliable witnesses who had nothing to gain by lying than the resurrection of Jesus Christ. This is a fact of history. In fact, when you get to verse 20 and you look at that, Paul lays that out there. He talks about how it is that you can tear this whole thing apart by letting people come up with their own ideas, but he says, in fact, that's the key. You notice that? In fact, Christ has been raised from the dead, the first fruits of those who have fallen asleep. Now here's the next thing he establishes. God did this to prove it could be done. Why did he need to prove it can be done? Oh, come on, this is not a tough one. Why did God need to prove that this could be done? Why did he need to show you he could raise people from the dead? It validated him, there's a starting point. But even more than that, it validated when he made a promise he could raise you. Can he deliver?
Yes.
There's the key. I don't ask tough questions. You all get to, if I say anything, am I going to, I don't ask the tough ones. I put it right out in front of you. That's the whole thing. Nobody's going to get embarrassed here. I give you the easy. I'm putting it over the plate. Take a swing. Come on. Here's the thing.
Knuckle curve spitter.
That's not what I'm doing. Now that's what we're going to see here. I want you to come into this. And I want you to understand this is a critical doctrine for the Christian church. And I understand that Christians don't. How many of you have heard someone share the gospel that included the promise of a bodily resurrection?
Not many.
Yeah.
I don't hear that much.
Yeah.
I don't hear that much at all. It does not seem to be there. But Romans 8:23 points out that having been saved spiritually, we now await the redemption of our bodies. Paul lays that out there. Now here's a verse for you. Let's see if you can finish it. John 6:44. No man comes to the Father but by me. And that's not the whole verse. What does it say after that? Anybody know how to finish that one? Here you go. And I will raise him up on the last day. You ever hear people finish that verse anymore? You don't. That is critical to it. John 5:48, Jesus says, the hour is coming when all those who are in the grave shall hear the voice of the Son of Man and come forth. Anybody have problems understanding what he's saying there? That seem ambiguous? There's a lot of different ways to view that. No, he's saying, I'm going to call, people are going to be in the grave, and what are they going to do? They're going to come out. That's a pretty bold claim. Unless you can deliver on it. What is amazing to me is we're not the only generation that kind of missed that. The disciples were unclear on the concept. They heard this guy say it all the time. Now, I do know one person that got it. I want a story for you. I want you to turn to John chapter 11, if you would. Just to get a sense of this, John chapter 11, we're going to look at Lazarus here. Now, I want you to think about this for a minute and think of what's going on here. Let me give you the setting. Lazarus has been ill for a time and is likely to die. Jesus has heard that Lazarus is sick and might die. You know what Jesus does?
Stays away.
He stays away. He does nothing. Jesus didn't like Lazarus?
No, love the family too.
Loved the family. They hung out there all the time. They were buds. Jesus is healing everybody everywhere. And his good friend and supporter, Lazarus, is dying. And Jesus goes, we're going to stay here.
Here the disciples like, are we going?
Exactly. Aren't we going to go? Now understand, the disciples' faith was, we've seen him heal everybody. We know he can heal Lazarus. Jesus waits, and what happens to Lazarus? He dies. And the disciples, Jesus says, we're going to go to Lazarus' house. The disciples go, what's the point now? What's the point?
If there was any time the disciples would say, duh, that might be it.
They don't get it. They don't understand why they're going to have to go there. But there's something going on here I need you to see. Starting in verse 12. Now, I want you to, Martha and Mary are the other two of the women in the household. Their brother Lazarus has died. And Jesus finally arrives in the scene. Now, when Jesus came, he found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb for days. 4 days, right? Bethany was near Jerusalem, about 2 miles off, and many of the Jews had come to Martha and Mary to console them concerning their brother's death. So when Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went out and met him, but Mary remained seated in the house. Now I want you to notice the difference in attitudes here. Here's what Martha says to Jesus: Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Now, I have heard this said a number of different times. Martha is mad and she is accusing Jesus. And if you stop right there, I think you would say that's exactly right. I don't think that's the case. I want you to read the rest of this. Martha says, she goes out to meet. Mary stays. Now Mary's going to say the same line, and Mary means it as an accusation. But Martha goes out and, Rabbi, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. I think she's hurt. She sees it, but she is recognizing something. You could have healed anything you wanted to. But here's why I know she's not upset. Listen, but even now, I know that whatever you ask from God, God will give you. What is Martha saying there?
It's not too late.
The disciples have already written this one off.
Say the word.
The disciples have written this off. This lady, evidently may be the only person in all of Jerusalem right now that has been listening, says to him, you could have stopped it if you'd wanted to, but even now, she is anticipating resurrection. Can you understand that level of faith? That's impressive to me. Even now. Now here Jesus tests her a little bit. And Jesus said to her, your brother will rise again. Martha said to him, now wait a minute. She's going, I know that. But you're not catching what I'm asking, Jesus. Here it is. I know that he will rise again in the resurrection of the last day. She says, I was listening. I know that. That's not what I'm asking. You get it? She knows the theology, and she's saying, Jesus, I'm not just taking the comfort of knowing that Lazarus will come back at some point. I'm looking right now. But Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and life. Whoever believes in me, though he die, yet shall he live. And everyone who lives and believes in me shall never die. Do you believe this? Do you think Jesus really needs an answer to that? They're making sure we're on the same page, but he knows she does. She may be the only person there who actually believes that at this point in time. And she said to him, yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God, who is coming into the world. Now in the next section, Mary meets him and says the same thing, but there's not the rest of that conversation. Mary goes, if you had been here, he would have died. She's ticked. Martha believes. This is the faith that was the right faith. And what is sad is many Christians are more like Mary than Martha. They're more like the disciples at this phase than they are Martha. Martha gets it. This is part of our gospel. It always has been. If you've been listening to Jesus, it would have been clear. Now, as I said, the culture didn't want to believe this. Remember the Greek dualism? Remember the Greek problem? Body dies, we bury it, it goes to the earth, or we burn it, it goes to ash. I now am resurrected. Why would I want my now free spirit to be stuck back in that decaying flesh? That's weird in their minds. And if you think about it from a purely human viewpoint, does that make sense?
A little, but if he can resurrect you, why couldn't he make the body?
They couldn't get to that next one. They couldn't get
He
there.
can't do that. Why can't he do that?
And even the Jews at the time, most rabbis would tell you that when you died and God would resurrect you, you'd come back exactly like you were before. And here's the Greek thinking. I just got out of that mess. I have dealt with age and death and disease, all that stuff. Why would I want to start that process again? And in their mind, this one didn't help. Lazarus, Peter's mother-in-law, because what happened to every one of those people that was raised from the dead? They died again. And here's the Greek thinking. Why would I want to go through that again? Now, yeah, maybe I get a little extra years, but knowing that it's going to be all those things. If you've lived a number of years now, you're recognizing things aren't as good as they used to be.
Oh, boy, howdy.
Silly little things that aren't so okay. I know you guys, wait.
I don't know, he's shaking his head yes. I'm like,
Already.
Stupid things that are just annoying. I broke my hand. You know, I was up here teaching with that thing on my hand for a number of weeks. It is mostly healed. But what is frustrating to me is the digital dexterity that used to be a real mark of what I used to do for a living. It doesn't work anymore. Not like it used to, just from that little change. Those things are frustrating. The Greeks go, I don't need that again. We don't want that. And so when they're thinking, your faith about this resurrection stuff is nonsense. I don't get it. And so they believed body dies, body bad, spirit lives. Now, here's the problem. What was life like as a pure spiritual being? And the Greeks would say, I have no idea. And you know why we have no idea? Because we weren't created to live in that state permanently. As frustrating as aging and dying can be, the simple reality is, isn't there something about taste, touch, and smell that actually are an aspect of life that is an enhancement that we actually enjoy? And God intends for that to continue. It's an interesting thing that Paul said this in 2 Corinthians. He said, we will not live as naked spirits. Isn't that an interesting comment? In other words, you aren't going to be just that spiritual thing. I've read a number of science fiction writers that always thought, man will evolve and someday be pure energy. And I'm thinking, that's not making me feel better about the future. I'm not thinking that's a great idea. There are things about this that matter. So we come to that now. Here comes the question. How are the dead raised? And understand the question actually means, how is it even possible that the dead are raised? That's the question that's being asked. How can that work out? What the obstacles to be overcome? And understand their thinking. And I've had people say this. In fact, you know, there are some Christians who absolutely oppose the idea of cremation because they're worried that God won't be able to find all of your body to resurrect you.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, it is not uncommon among Christians to believe that's a worry.
The Catholics believe that, right?
I'm not sure if the Catholics do it. I don't want to speak to that without being sure, but I've run into a number of places. People are worried about that. Now,
What about all the bodies that are cast in the sea on
That's
ships that got eaten by
exactly-
fish and whatever?
here's
What about
the,
your body in the grave that get all the insects eat and all the germs and everything? You can't-
there you go. And this is what the Greeks are saying. The Greeks are saying, look at what the obstacles are for your God to overcome. The guy dies in the desert. Nobody there to bury him. The body rots and is blown by the wind. It's gone. How can your God work this out? In their mind, you see God coming along. I'm trying to resurrect him. Brian, I'd like to, but I'm missing a knee here. And I'm one rib short. I look everywhere.
Plus an eye, you look like a
You know?
cyclops.
And that's what their challenge is. Logically, they go, this can't work. There's too many things to overcome. People who are died and beheaded and their body burned and all these things. And William Wallace, the hero of our Celtic background, was drawn and quartered. They cut his body to parts and sent the different parts around the kingdom as a warning. And the Greeks are going, how do you put that back together?
They didn't have enough faith.
Understand, they had no such faith because their gods were too small for the task. In the Greek religion, they're right. Their gods, quite frankly, belong more in Marvel comics than as gods because they're basically humans with superpowers. Just as petty, just as stupid as humans, but that's what they were.
And all I thought he created everything from nothing. So even if he had nothing, he still created your body.
Yes.
Myron?
Yes.
Side note, if you read Genesis, the pre-fallen body was a whole different state, and there's this little thing in the New Testament about God knows every hair. Not going down too many rabbit trails, but I've had these conversations with pretty high-end people. We're digital representations, obviously, so he has an index on every hair, meaning every atom in our body. The pre-fallen body was eternal. Part of the fall is it became uneternal. There was no second law of thermodynamics. So if
At
you go
that
back
time,
to
there
the-
wasn't.
You go back to the pre-fallen world.
But if you're gonna get ahead of me, that's Kevin's job, and I don't know what you're doing.
No, seriously, think about it, Adam and Eve were eternal, right?
They were eternal, but also I will jump all the way to the end, and I'll put this. The body we are going to get is not going back to what Adam had.
Yeah.
Adam's body was eternal, but it was not built as a spiritual body. Understand this, Adam had a choice to make between the tree of knowledge of good and evil, or life, and he chose the knowledge of good and evil. If he had chosen life, the body that Christ had would have been his body, that would have been the next step. He was not designed for death, but he was not yet designed for heaven.
That's also where the second law of thermodynamics came in, because the whole creation of the universe.
Okay, the rabbit needs to die.
Good work, Dave.
There we go.
Stamp it.
This is highly intellectual human thinking, and here's the question based on this thing: how can the dead possibly be raised? How are the dead raised, and with what kind of body do they come? And Paul, Mr. Sensitivity here, Paul is always very kindly disposed to people who ask stupid questions. Paul never gets frustrated, he's never sarcastic, that's just not Paul. Paul immediately responds in verse 36, how stupid can you be? You foolish person. You're an idiot. He's basically saying that. You think you're asking this question because you're so smart. That's a stupid question. You're starting from a wrong place. You don't get it. And here's what he's going to do. He's saying, your logic is this: because I can't understand how it works, it can't be true. But he's going to give us an example. He goes, there are things in this world that you don't understand that you know are true because you see them all the time. And he's going to give us an illustration. He says, tell you what, let's talk about this. Let's take something that looks dead, you put it in the soil, and it actually decomposes and then comes back to life. You know what this is called? A seed. It's called a seed. Here's what he's going to say here. What you sow is not the body. That is to be. But a bare kernel, perhaps of wheat or of some other grain. But God gives it a body as he has chosen, and to each kind of seed its own body. Now here's what he's saying. You know the principle because you see it all the time. This is an agrarian culture by and large. And you know this fact. You take something that has no sense of life to it. You put it in the soil, it decomposes, and then life comes out of it. And what is interesting is the life that comes out of it looks nothing like what went into the dirt. Have you ever noticed that? That's different. And yet it is somehow tied in principle to what went into the dirt. And he's saying, you see this all the time. Jesus even made that comment in Mark. He goes, the farmer plants, goes to bed, and he has no idea how it works, but he will wake up and have plants. He doesn't know how it works. But you say, oh, but today we do. The principle still applies. And even when we didn't know how it worked, did it still work? In all the generations where they had no idea why this thing would go in there, decompose, and grow into a plant, did it always work? Seeds grow plants. And life comes out of them that is completely different than the life you saw go into the soil. It's different. And that always works. Are there some things today that anybody here know how to split an atom? Do you know it can be done? Why?
Could you see this big explosion?
There was these big, there was a bomb thing that went off, I seem to recall. It seems that they managed to pull that off. Again, just because you don't know how it works means it isn't so. How do you know it's so? Because you can see it. In the case of resurrection, have we seen it? Is Paul's challenge. Yes, we have. God seems to have that under control. God understands, and he knows what's going to come out of every seed. Now, there's another thing. I could probably come up here and go down to the store and buy about 15 different flower seeds. I could spread them all out here. How many of you could identify which seed goes to which flower?
Not me.
Sunflower seeds, some.
Now, some gardeners might. Some people might be there. Some farmers could probably tell you which seed goes to which kind of thing. But again, the bottom line is not everybody understands or even can tell, but God knows. and he knows what he's going to plant, and he knows what's going to come out of it, and he's got it under control. But God gives a body as he has chosen to each kind of seed, its own body. Now here's the thing. Now he's going to address this. Your God is too small for this, mine's not. And here's how it works. For not all flesh is the same. Wow, there's a brilliant, who would have thought that? Paul's hitting him with a real difficult concept. Not all flesh is the same. But there's one kind of humans, another for animals, another for birds, and another for fish. Now what's he saying here? God has had this propensity for making things suited to the environment they live in. And have you noticed that? That God can make a fish designed to swim in the water. He can make a bird designed to float in the air. He can make a human designed to move on the land. He can do these things, different flesh for different things, and it's perfectly suited to the environment it will live in. Now, that sounds impressive, doesn't it? Do you think that a God that can design with that special purpose can do it again for eternity? Do you think he might be able to come with a body that will work in heaven? And that's his challenge. God has already done this. I mean, look at the complexity of the human brain, the vascular system. It seems like God has this nailed. He seems to have it under control. One kind for a human. And there's fact, let's look at the complexity. There are heavenly bodies and earthly bodies. But the glory of the heavenly is of one kind, and the glory of the earthly is another kind. Here's what he's saying. Not only do that with fish and men and animals, have you looked at the universe you live in? Have you bothered to go out at night, maybe not here with all the lights, but someplace, and look at the sky? Any of you do stargazing? Gosh, nobody? Try it sometime. Here's something that you may not know. Every star is a different color. Every last one of them. Why? Because depending on the size of the star, the heat, and its age, its brilliance will be different. And the color it gives off will be different. Every planet has a different look. And they're saying God was able to design all of these by their billions exactly and different and yet perfectly suited to where they're at. This is the level of the God we're talking about. Forget Zeus. Forget Adonis. This is a different kind of God.
He's just like us. We're all the same, but we're different. Each one's different.
Exactly. Even super identical twins are different. There are differences. Every blade of grass in your lawn is different, even if it's the same kind of grass. All different, all unique. And God designed them. There's one kind of glory for the sun, another glory for the moon, another glory for the stars. For every star differs from a star in glory. And in glory, isn't that an interesting term to use? Each one has its own glory. Why would he use that term? One each has its own beauty, but who ultimately gets the glory for every one of these things that happens?
Creator.
Every last one of them points to a creator, and that's his point. Every last one of these says and screams God, if you're honest. Every last one of them has that capacity. Now here it comes. So it is with the resurrection of the dead. God handled those. He's going to do this. Now, what kind of body? What is sown perishable will be raised imperishable. If it is sown in dishonor, it is raised in glory. If it is sown in weakness, it will be raised in power. It is sown a natural body, it will be raised a spiritual body. We're going to plant the seed, and God's going to bring something suited to life. Forget your Greek dualism. God doesn't do Walking Dead. He brings a body that's going to be suited to life. Now let's think about that. What kind of body is this? If only God had given us a prototype that we could look at to understand how this body might function. Do we have one? What do you notice about Jesus after coming out of the grave that was a little different than how you experienced living in the mortal body?
Walk through solid things.
A locked room, he walks through walls, but he's not a ghost because he can be held and embraced. They can touch his hands. Now somehow he's solid and yet
Not.
He can eat and didn't need to. So he could enjoy, but he didn't have to. Now, wouldn't that be nice?
Donuts.
You know, I can go for the second dessert this time. Okay. There are things that are different. You see him walking with people who didn't recognize him initially and then suddenly he's gone. Do you understand that? He's there, and when his mind says, I need to be someplace else, you know where he is? Someplace else. That's different. That's what a prototype is for, to demonstrate what the product can do. Yeah, anybody ever built prototypes? The whole idea to build a prototype is to take, and I'm going to go demonstrate why this product is great. Look at all the things it can do. You're all going to want one of these. I should make a lot of them. Christ was the prototype. This is what God could do. You all ought to want one of these.
Yeah, his worked the first time. I've had the other issues.
We're talking the perfect prototype. That was my world. We only got one shot at it. We need something that does this, and it needs to work when we take it in the field. Now, we didn't get a chance for failure, and I understand that. But the perfect prototype is nice if it works exactly like it's supposed to. And you see that in here. It is sown in dishonor. Sown in natural body is raised a spiritual body. If there is a natural body, there's also a spiritual body. Thus it is written, the first man, Adam, became a living being, but the last Adam became a life-giving spirit. You understand the comparison he's making here? It's not going to be like Adam, the first one. It's going to be like Christ. This is life. This is eternal life in it. But it is not the spiritual that is first, but the natural, and then the spiritual. And here he goes again, back that idea of the seed. It will change. God is going to make something completely different. The first man was from the earth, a man of dust. The second man is from heaven. As was the man of dust, so also are those who are of the dust. And is of the man of heaven are also all those who are of heaven. Tie yourself to Christ and you'll be ready for this. Stop thinking in human terms. Just as we have a home and have become we have borne the image of the man of dust, we shall also bear the image of the man of heaven. God is going to work this out. God is going to take this where it needs to be. You're not struggling with this. Stop thinking like the world. That was the promise of 1 John 3:2. We shall be like him. This chapter fits in here because it challenges us with something. You have to think differently. You have been freed from the stupidity of a pagan world. And understand that. This world is not scientific. This world is not getting wiser and wiser. This world is getting more and more pagan. That's the reality of our culture. It is pagan. It is a religious construct based on personal preference. And Paul is trying to get the church to understand we operate on a foundation of unchanging truth. When I was at college, they used to like to taunt me they got t-shirts, and it says, facts don't care about your faith. And they like to wear those in front of me. And I used to love those t-shirts because they were absolutely right. The problem was they forgot which of us had the facts and which of us had a life based entirely upon faith. And there was a blind faith. And this is the world. It'll wear the shirt with the slogan right in their face and be too stupid to understand it.
Nothing to be wise.
They became fools. And that is the reality we're dealing with. This culture is not to be intimidating to us. It should not be. It is foolish at its foundation. It has no basis in fact to found any of their beliefs on. And understand that if there's anything that has come good out of the LGBTQ movement, it is this. It has exposed the fallacy that this is a culture based on science. Right in there, they have added, as the acronym gets bigger, they now have a 2. Anybody know what the 2 stands for?
Transgender.
Two-spirit. You know where they get the idea? Native American faith. It is a religious construct that has nothing to do with science. And they can stick that in there and still act like they're talking about a scientific view of life.
Mhm.
That's the world we live in. That's the culture we're dealing with. And Paul is warning the Corinthians, all of your problems stem from this. You're letting the world tell you how to think. Knock it off. And you will get some things right. Tim, you want to close turn that off?